I'm Teresa Skubic, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, February 26th. We begin tonight with some serious questions being asked about Mark Carney's involvement in Brookfield Asset Management. During the Liberal leadership debate last night, Mark Carney was asked by a reporter from the Globe and Mail about Brookfield's decision to move their head office from Toronto to New York and if he approved of that decision.
Next question, please. Prochaine question.
Bonsoir, Frédéric Plante with the Globe and Mail. You were the vice chairman at Brookfield Asset Management prior to
the chair. I was the chair.
Sorry. In the fall, they moved their head office from Toronto to New York. Did you approve of that decision, and what does this say about your commitment to growing Canada's economy and betting on Canada as for now?
Okay. So two things. I just correct a few factual things. One, I was chair of Brookfield Asset Management. I ceased to be chair on the 15th, I think, of January when I announced for leadership. Also ceased to be chair of Bloomberg as well. Ceased to be United Nations Special Envoy on Climate Action Finance. Ceased to be a number of other things. So I resigned all my positions because I am all in for Canada, all in for this leadership, all in during this time of crisis to build our great country, okay? That's the first thing. Second, the formal decision of the board happened after I ceased to be on the board. I do not have a connection with Brookfield Asset Management. No longer have a role, obviously, as I resigned in the middle of January.
However, documents released today show that Mr. Carney actually encouraged the board of Brookfield to move their office to New York on December 1st, 2024, prior to his resignation. We reached out to Brookfield for comment, but they did not respond to our request. And the Conservatives were quick to jump on the disparity, with Conservative MP Michael Barrett accusing Mr. Carney of lying to Canadians about his role at Brookfield.
Last night, Mark Carney lied to Canadians. He lied to Canadians, saying that his company, Brookfield Asset Management, only moved their headquarters from Canada to Donald Trump's hometown of New York City after he had resigned from the board. Now, we all know that Brookfield made that announcement on October the 31st, proving that Mr. Carney was lying to Canadians. But this morning, we can share with you a letter signed by Mark Carney on December the 1st. Now, this is just days after Donald Trump had threatened Canada for the first time with unjustified tariffs. Now, this letter says that the decision by the board, of which Mark Carney at that time was chair, was unanimous to move the headquarters and Canadian jobs to Donald Trump's hometown of New York City. And the letter implores shareholders, urges them to support the move. Now, this is not surprising, but it is extraordinary to have Mark Carney stand before Canadians and in response to media questions to lie.
Michael Barrett also urged Mr. Carney to disclose his financial interests in case he becomes Prime Minister.
It's now more important than ever that he disclose all of his financial interests and conflicts of interest, knowing that he's been advising the Liberals and Justin Trudeau for 5 years and not having disclosed what his interests were to this point. It's imperative that it happens in case he becomes Prime Minister. And it's more important than ever now that he's demonstrably lied to Canadians. We know that we can't trust what Mark Carney says, and we now know that he will put profits for himself and for well-connected insiders on Bay Street and now on Wall Street ahead of Canadians.
Mr. Barrett was asked by reporters on why the corporate move really matters.
Donald Trump asked companies to move to the United States, asked them to take their jobs, to take their investment dollars to the United States. And we saw this during his first term, and we're seeing it again now. He hadn't even taken office but he had threatened Canada with unjustified and unjust tariffs on Canada and on Canadians. And what was the response from Mark Carney? It was to immediately support and to his board unanimously voting to move their headquarters from Canada to New York City, not standing up to Donald Trump, not protecting Canadian interests, Canadian investment, Canadian jobs, not even modeling good behavior. He did exactly what Donald Trump asked before he was even in the Oval Office. And the purpose, as outlined in the letter from Mark Carney to shareholders, where he implores them, where he begs them to vote in support of moving this Canadian jobs to the United States, it's for profits. It was so that they could make more money, so that Mark Carney could make more money, and that his well-connected friends would make more money doing exactly what Donald Trump has asked.
Conservative strategist Anthony Kosh joined us earlier for his reaction to the accusations.
Well, here's the whole point, right? Since Trump started his tariff threats, the Liberals have done a lot of work in framing the next election about who is the best person to handle President Donald J. Trump, which is a fair framing. I think they might have overdone it a little bit, but the point being, Mark Carney has spent the better part of his entire leadership race attacking Donald Trump, much like his Liberal colleagues, and making a big hoopla about how Mr. Poilievre is not the right person to handle Canada's economic future. Meanwhile, we now find out that mere weeks after President Trump was elected president of the United States, Mark Carney personally appealed in a written letter that has now been published to his board and shareholders at Brookfield to approve the move of their headquarters from Toronto to New York City. In other words, Mr. Carney had more faith and belief in the future economy as he saw it built by Donald Trump than he did in the economy that he himself built with the help of Justin Trudeau. So we'll see how much of this goes out, but the big important part here is not only what happened, is the fact that when he was asked about it point blank, he lied to the Canadian public. So if there was nothing that was done that was wrong or improper, why not just say it? Fact of the matter is they know this is a sore spot. They know this is a weakness. The optics are horrible, and they thought people weren't going to be able to figure out the details on this. But now that they have, so it's double. One, why'd you move the business? But two, why, when you were asked about it, did you lie about your involvement?
We also asked Anthony for his thoughts on what Chrystia Freeland should do in response to the scandal.
I think leadership races are unique in this respect because you're running for the opportunity to run, if that makes sense. And a very big part of that equation is the individual in question actually electable? Then we might really like them inside the House as Liberals. We might think they're fantastic. But once they're actually leader of the party, Lord knows as Conservatives, we've had this debate far too many times over the course of the last decade. Once they're actually the leader of the party, will Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde, or Mr. and Mrs. Everybody, as we say in French, actually like them enough to make them prime minister? And I absolutely believe that if I was working on the Freeland campaign, I would be jumping on this saying that Mr. Carney represents a massive liability for the Liberal Party of Canada going against Pierre Poilievre in the next election, where dealing with Donald Trump will feature very prominently on the list of issues that people are considering when they cast their ballot. She needed to attack him yesterday. She needed to attack him the day before. She needed to be attacking him at various points in this campaign, and she hasn't done that. There still is some time, so she should probably start. But it's just, that's the thing. This has been hardly erased. The last 2 days have hardly been debates. They were more panel discussions or, group interviews where everybody talks about how much they agree with one another. And that's unfortunately a surefire way to lose a race when you've got a massive deficit with the front runner.
Early this afternoon at his first cabinet meeting, Donald Trump announced that tariffs on Canada will now be delayed until April 2nd.
Mr. President, can you clarify the Canada-Mexico tariffs? You had put that 30-day pause, but you just referred to April.
25%.
25%. When does it go into effect?
April 2nd.
April 2nd for Canada-Mexico.
Correct. And for everything.
Well, we have the fentanyl-related is a pause. If they can prove to the president they've done an excellent job That's what they first do in 30 days.
Have you guys seen any
But then the overall is April 2nd. So the big transaction is April 2nd, but the fentanyl-related things, they're working hard on the border. At the end of that 30 days, they have to prove to the president that they've satisfied him to that regard. If they have,
gonna be
then
hard
he'll
to
give them a pause, or he won't.
All right, when we return from the break, we'll go over the main takeaways of last night's Liberal leadership debate from each of the candidates. Then we'll turn to speculation that Donald Trump is looking to remove Canada from the Five Eyes intelligence sharing group. Don't go anywhere. Forum Daily will be right back after these messages. The second Liberal leadership debate took place in Montreal yesterday, and U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats were the first topic on the candidates' agenda. Ms. Freeland, who has spent most of the campaign painting herself as the best person to take on Mr. Trump, said in her opening statement, quote, "Trump is unleashed and empowered. As your prime minister, I will be too."
I'm running to be leader of the Liberal Party and the next Prime Minister of Canada because Trump is posing the gravest challenge our country has faced since the Second World War. He's threatening us with economic warfare. That's not new. Last time, he threatened to rip up NAFTA, and he imposed tariffs on our steel and aluminum. I fought back, and I won. This time, Trump's threats are even worse. He wants to make us the 51st state. Trump is unleashed and empowered. As your prime minister, I will be too. I have the experience, the plan, and the guts to stand up to Trump, to tell him that Canada is not for sale. And if he hits us, we'll hit him back.
Mark Carney fell back on his experience running the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis and heading the Bank of England during Brexit negotiations.
During my career, I've had the honor of serving our country, including as governor of the Bank of Canada during the financial crisis of 2008. Right now, as my colleagues have said, Canada faces one of the most serious crises in our history. To get through it, we will need to build a strong economy, and that requires big changes. Canadians have been telling me that they want change. They want positive change that builds this country. I can bring that change. I know how to manage crises. I know how to build strong economies. Yes, there are a lot of uncertainties, but during a crisis, it's important to distinguish what you can't control and what we can control. We can't change Donald Trump, but we can control our economic destiny. We are masters in our own home. I have a plan that puts more money back in your pockets, a plan that makes our companies more competitive, a plan that builds a strong economy that works for you. Canadians are ready to stand up for their country. I'm ready to stand with them and bring the right change for Canada.
Mr. Carney is the only candidate who hasn't been an MP in Trudeau's government, but Conservatives have criticized him for being an advisor to Trudeau. At multiple points in the debate, Mr. Carney made some effort to differentiate himself from the Trudeau Liberals.
I'm different in the following respects. First, focus on the economy. Laser focus on the economy, and that means good jobs, people's wages growing faster than inflation. It means getting prices down. It means building homes. It means building a future for this country. Secondly, I'm much more hands-on. I'm much more of a hands-on person, hands-on manager. I focus on results and getting things done. Thirdly, and I've heard this, I'm fortunate to have support in the caucus. I hear directly from the supporters about more regular and two-way dialogue with the caucus. I meet with my supporters virtually during the course of this leadership campaign to hear their ideas, to hear their energy, to hear what's going on, what they're seeing on the ground, to share my perspectives in order to move forward.
They also discussed health care, with Mark Carney, Chrystia Freeland, and Karina Gold saying that the government needs to make it easier for foreign health professionals to work in Canada.
We have to make it better by training more doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners here in Canada, by recognizing foreign credentials and by allowing credentials to be portable across the country. By inviting the great doctors and nurses, Canadian ones, in the U.S. who want to come home, encouraging them to come home, making it possible. And finally, we need to be clear with Canadians who care about their healthcare system. You cannot trust Pierre Poilievre with our universal single-payer healthcare system. All he believes in is cuts, cuts, cuts.
Frank Bayless says that Canada needs to give nurse practitioners a greater role in the system, expand pharmacists' scope of practice, and invest in home care.
I've spent 40 years of my career in the healthcare industry, and I can give you examples where I've walked through emergency rooms, down the hallways, and I've seen people in gurneys up and down there, and it's broken my heart. So I'm absolutely committed to fixing the healthcare system. What we need is a change in paradigm. Our system was designed in the 1960s when the population generally was younger, and it was designed for acute care. Now we have a chronic care problem. So we need to redesign our system to treat chronic care. Presently, there's only 2 doorways into the system. If you're lucky, you have a family doctor, and if you're not, what do they tell you to do? Go to the emergency room. So what I want to do is open 3 more doors into the system. I want to go to pharmacists, first of all, and expand their scope of practice. They can do so much. I want them to do a lot more, which they're trained to do. Number 2, I want to train 6,000 nurses to become what we call nurse practitioners. That would allow them to do almost as much as a doctor and have them staffed across the country. And finally, I want to invest in home care.
Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly has been speaking with European allies about Ottawa's efforts to boost intelligence sharing between EU partners and Canada as longtime ally Washington starts to diverge from Canada on issues like Ukraine. Speaking at a virtual news conference from London, Ms. Joly says she had a discussion about security with UK National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell. She says that she has expressed interest in establishing deeper intelligence collaboration with Australia, the UK, and others outside the US. And on intelligence sharing, the world of foreign policy was buzzing on Tuesday after the Financial Times published a report claiming that the Trump administration was looking to have Canada removed from the Five Eyes intelligence sharing group. However, late on Tuesday afternoon, a senior Trump administration official explained that the U.S. would never do that.
Because I got to be in there. But this nonsense from the Financial Times is a product of a culture in the media where they report stories and never name their sources. And my view is that we should never have to comment on any story where it's based on unnamed sources. Have you ever noticed that? Okay, that was just crazy stuff. We would never, ever jeopardize our national security, ever, with allies like Canada, ever. So please stop doing that. And I have proposed, and I hope somebody's hearing me, that we just don't pay any attention to any questions that are based on anonymous sources. That's all I got to say. We'll talk maybe later today. We got a nice sign in the Oval on another executive order, but I appreciate everything you're doing.
The allowance allows the U.S., UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to pool resources, share surveillance data, and coordinate efforts to monitor communications and other intelligence targets, as well as tackle moderate threats like terrorism and cyber attacks. Last night, Donald Trump reinstated a rule requiring cost transparency in healthcare. The order requires hospitals to post online the rates for some of their more common services, like MRI scans to C-section deliveries. Mr. Trump has long sought to address the secrecy that often surprises patients with treatment invoices.
It's one of the biggest things that can happen to reducing cost in healthcare. It takes a little while to kick in, but Biden ended it immediately upon coming in, which was a terrible travesty, in my opinion, and we're going to start it up, and we've actually made it even stronger. Yes, sir. By a couple of major factors, right? Anybody have any question on price transparency? It allows people to go out and negotiate and price, and you're not allowed to even talk about it when you go into a hospital or see a doctor, and this allows you to go out and talk about it, and it's actually one of the biggest. There's a couple of people that actually going back a long way that feel that are real pros in the industry feel this is the biggest thing you can do for cutting prices, and it certainly is one of them. And it's been unpopular in some circles because people make less money, but it's great for the patient. It's great for the people in our country. Okay, it's not so good for pharmaceuticals. It's not so good for the companies that make the drugs. And I guess you could say it probably isn't so great for hospitals, but they say that if you have a great hospital that's really knows what they're doing, it's actually great for a hospital because everybody wants to go there.
U.S. President Donald Trump says he wants to see the Keystone XL pipeline built. He says the pipeline expansion would have sent more oil sands crude to the U.S. Gulf Coast, adding it would get easy approvals and an almost immediate start if it's revived. While Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says the project never should have been canceled, the owner of the existing Keystone system says the company has moved on from the expansion plan. It is also unclear how President Trump's view on Keystone aligns with his stance on hitting Canada with tariffs on oil, given that Keystone would be transporting oil from Canada to the U.S. All right, don't go anywhere. After the break, Israel and Hamas officials have reached an agreement to exchange the bodies of hostages for the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. And Ukraine's president reaches a framework economic deal with the U.S. for rare earth minerals. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world when we return from the commercial break. Stay with us. Israeli and Hamas officials have reached an agreement to exchange the dead bodies of hostages for the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Israel delayed the release of 600 Palestinian prisoners out of protest of the cruel treatment of hostages during their release by Hamas. The militant group called the delay a serious violation of their ceasefire and that talks on a second phase are not possible until they are freed. And while speaking at the International Security Conference, Israel's head of Mossad, David Barnea, acknowledged for the first time publicly that it was Israel who was responsible for the pager explosions that rocked Hezbollah in September 2024.
On the emblem of the Mossad, there is the phrase that you wage war by using trickstery. And this is an important component of the Mossad's agenda. The pager operation is a great demonstration of realizing our objective. It was planned by Mossad operatives using trickery, using thoughtfulness. It demonstrates deep understanding and penetration of the enemy, technological advancements and superiority, and extreme technological capabilities. This operation marks the turning point in the north and the opening point for the 10 days during which we changed or turned the tables in the north with our enemies. A clear line can be drawn from the pages to the elimination of Nasrallah and the agreement. Hezbollah sustained a severe blow that broke the spirit of the organization. Victory in war is not measured in the amount of casualties or rockets, but victory on the spirit, morale, and motivation of the enemy.
Mr. Barnea also explained how the pager operation came to be and the justification for it.
The idea for the pager operation was surfaced when we understood that it's not enough to use the radio, the handheld radios in all scenarios, so we thought of a different way to hit in a targeted way by exploding a device that's always on the person of Hezbollah operatives, and we found the opportunity. The first infrastructure were established in 2022, and the first shipment to Lebanon with 500 pagers only reached Lebanon several weeks before the horrible massacre of October 7th.
The spy chief also explained that the decision to launch the operation was ultimately Prime Minister Netanyahu's, and that he made that call against the advice of some of his top advisors.
The Prime Minister ultimately made the decision in total contradiction to most opinions expressed in the meeting. And here we are today getting this prize. This is a prize to the entire Israeli people. not only to the Mossad, a prize for campaign facing Hezbollah, bringing back the residents to the north, weakening Iran in the region. The day where thousands of pagers blew up in the hands of Hezbollah operatives, terrorists, will be remembered as a day of a turning point in the war. It's a day where the power of trickery in war grew or overpowered kinetic power.
Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says a framework economic deal with the U.S. is ready, but he says security guarantees that Kyiv views as vital remain to be decided, and a full agreement could hinge on talks in Washington as early as Friday. Mr. Zelensky says Ukraine needs to know where the United States stands on its continued military support. He expects to have a wide-ranging talk with U.S. President Donald Trump during a visit to Washington. President Trump implied that security guarantees will largely fall on Europe.
Would you provide military support for Ukraine in the future as part
You mean
of
like
this
security?
agreement? Yeah.
Well, people are going to do it. I think Europe will largely be responsible for that.
But
European countries will be responsible.
But Macron asked for a U.S. backup.
Well, we'll see. I mean, right now we're just in the process of negotiating. We've pretty much negotiated our deal on raw earth and various other things. We'll be looking at that security. You're talking about general security for Ukraine later on. I don't think that's going to be a problem. There are a lot of people that want to do it. And I spoke with Russia about it. They didn't seem to have a problem with it. So I think they understand. They're not going back in. Once we do this, they're not going back in.
And Donald Trump's earlier comments about democracy in Ukraine caused an uproar in the United States and around the world. Not only did Mr. Trump imply that Ukraine started the war against Russia, but he also implied that Vladimir Zelensky is a dictator because Ukraine hasn't held an election during the war. The National Post's Adam Zivo, who recently returned from Ukraine, took issue to these comments and joined us to explain.
Attempts to smear Zelensky as a dictator are misguided and often based on distortions. The decisions that Zelensky has made during the war are very much in line with historical wartime democratic norms. So critics will say that Zelensky is being autocratic because he hasn't held elections. When it comes to the elections, as of now, Ukraine's constitution forbids elections from being held during martial law. And martial law has been in effect since February 2022 because, in case people forget, there's been a widespread war that has led to 20% of the population of the country being occupied, and cities are routinely being hit by missiles. So by not holding elections, Zelensky is actually following the rules of his government rather than trying to redefine the constitution or reopen the constitution during a very unstable time. Now, this is nothing new. This is nothing special to Ukraine. It is very common for countries to not hold elections during wartime. That's what happened with the United Kingdom during World War II. And no reasonable person would say that Winston Churchill was a dictator. And in fact, during World War I, both the UK and Canada also suspended their elections. So would that mean that Canada devolved into dictatorship in the 1910s? No one would say that as well. Now, there are many commonsensical reasons why you don't want to hold an election during wartime. As of now, it's a total war, which means that any city in Ukraine is vulnerable to being attacked by a missile. Now, bear in mind, I spend most of my time in Odessa. I hear the explosions, right? And when there's an air raid alert, people can go to shelters. But if you have polling stations where you have a large number of people who are congregated, then you don't have the shelter to keep them safe, right? That capacity just isn't there. So you're creating opportunities for mass casualty events, which I don't think anyone would say is acceptable, right? And we have to keep in mind that Russia would be well aware of the fact that there would be an election occurring, and so they could strategically use this vulnerability to their advantage, which would mean, for example, could mean targeting certain cities or polling stations based on how they're expected to vote. That's just one of the many different possibilities for how Russia could interfere in the election. Ukraine requires in-person voting. And so that means every single vote that is cast needs to happen in a building with observers. And the counting of these ballots needs to also be witnessed by third-party observers as well. So when you have people going into the shelter and coming out, can you genuinely protect the integrity of the vote here, right? Moving all the observers, moving all the ballots, can you maintain the chain of custody? And that's, of course, only if there's no actual attack and it's just an air raid siren. If you have a full attack, what happens with the ballots? If they burn up, right? Do you do a redo? How does all of this work? Now, another problem is that because Ukraine requires in-person voting, which is an anti-corruption measure, they don't have absentee voting. They don't have mail-in ballots. And that is a problem, first of all, because many people are internally displaced. So then you have to go and update your voter registries to figure out where the hell everyone is, and that's not easy. Then, on top of that, there are millions of Ukrainians who are refugees abroad, and they can't vote with mail. And what that means is they have to go to their nearest embassy or consulate to vote. And sometimes that might mean traveling hundreds of kilometers. So many people don't have the capacity to do that. They don't have the resources. It shouldn't be surprising that in an October 2023 poll by the International Republican Institute, they found that around 62% of Ukrainians believe that elections should only be held after the war is over, which makes sense. People are pretty practical about war. Now, we don't have more recent data, but these findings are consistent with what journalists and volunteers working in Ukraine, like myself, have anecdotally heard on the ground. This is not a surprising finding. If Zelensky really was the dictator that his critics want him to be, the rational choice would be for him to defy the Ukrainian constitution and have a flawed election as soon as possible so that he could consolidate his power before his popularity further declines. He hasn't done that, which shows that he's not exploiting the situation for his own political career. In fact, last weekend, he told a bunch of journalists in a big press conference that he would be willing to step down as president in exchange for a durable peace deal or Ukraine getting into NATO. Now, maybe I'm crazy, but from my understanding, dictators generally don't volunteer to give up power for the good of their country, for the good of their people. So that throws a wrench into Trump's narrative.
All right, stay tuned. Up next, Donald Trump announces a new gold card visa program, and the premier of Newfoundland and Labrador steps down from his position. More of today's top national and international headlines right after this. While much of the Trump administration's focus on immigration has been to restrict migrants going to the U.S., the president and his commerce secretary announced a new gold card visa program.
We're going to be doing something else that's going to be very, very good. We're going to be selling a gold card. You have a green card. This is a gold card. We're going to be putting a price on that card of about $5 million, and that's going to give you green card privileges plus. It's going to be a route to citizenship, and wealthy people will be coming into our country by buying this card. They'll be wealthy, and they'll be successful, and they'll be spending a lot of money and paying a lot of taxes and employing a lot of people. And we think it's going to be extremely successful. Never been done before, anything like this, but it's something that we're going to be putting out over the next, would you say 2 weeks, Howard? Do you want to say a couple of words about it?
Sure.
Mr. President, are there
Wait a
any
minute.
requirements for that
Hang on a
gold
sec.
card? Do you have to invest a certain amount of money in this country in order to qualify for that gold card?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Go
the
ahead.
EB-5 program was really, you lend some money, but it was full of nonsense, make-believe, and fraud, and it was a way to get a green card that was low priced. So the president said, rather than having this sort of ridiculous EB-5 program, we're going to end the EB-5 program. We're going to replace it with the Trump Gold Card, which is really a green card gold. So they'll be able to pay $5 million to the U.S. government. They'll have to go through vetting, of course. We're going to make sure they're wonderful, world-class global citizens. They can come to America. The president can give them a green card, and they can invest in America, and we can use that money to reduce our deficit. Why do we give out lotteries of green cards? Why do we give out EB-5 for green cards? The President of the United States understands that the right answer is, why don't we eliminate the deficit of the United States of America instead?
Outgoing First Nations of Quebec and Labrador Chief Ghislaine Picard is stepping down after more than 3 decades, and he says Indigenous people risk being pushed aside in Canada's potential trade war with the United States. He joined us earlier to explain why he's concerned.
The simple answer to that is that Indigenous peoples are consumers themselves. So obviously they have their concerns are not less legitimate than the overall Canadian or Quebecois. So that's one issue. The other point is the whole notion or concept of the duty to consult has been defined, I mean, so many times over in the last 20 years. And to me, that principle really finds its place in the current debate, given that not only Quebec, but many different jurisdictions, including Canada, have said in this tariff tariff measures that Canada and the provinces will hold on to what's theirs, and but the thing is, what is not mentioned is the fact that much of the wealth in Canada has been achieved through the exploitation of natural resources and the lands, which ultimately belong to First Nations. So I think this is where governments are sort of, have lost track of the history in this country, and not only the history but the present as well, because we continue to have cases before the courts that are favorable to First Nations with regard to the ownership of lands and the natural resources therein. So to me, it should serve as a reminder that governments cannot act independently of the need to have First Nations involved.
He highlighted how different provinces have respected the duty to consult Indigenous people, specifically comparing BC and Quebec.
I'll take two examples, one Quebec and the other one British Columbia. British Columbia has a table called Team BC, and with a mandate to protect the interests of the province. And one of the first things that BC did is really to include First Nations representation at that table. In Quebec, we're nowhere near that. Instead, the premier will travel to Washington, saying that he's protecting the interests of the province, which is not, nobody will debate that or question it. But how he goes about it is probably where it becomes more, where we need to become more pay more attention to. The same premier just 3 weeks ago, speaking about energy transition and the fact that Quebec is looking to the future leading to 2035, where there needs to be an energy transition, trying to stay away from fossil fuels and so on. He said, "Well, we'll have to do that work, but it's not going to be done, in isolation of the need to sit down with First Nations." So he says that about 3 weeks ago, and then he comes out challenging Trump and the U.S. Just days ago, about a week ago. Not a single mention of First Nations. Yet he says, "Well, maybe we're going to have to consider a fast track on certain projects, wind farms, possibly dams as well." So I think we have a premier that's that's speaking from both sides of the mouth in this case.
He also highlighted that First Nations leaders are closely watching Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre.
Obviously, we don't have a very good or positive history with the Conservatives, going back to the Harper years, and but yet I think from a First Nation perspective, everybody's looking at the numbers. Everybody's looking at the current political environment, and it's how would I call it, uncertainty in terms of what will happen next. And obviously, the Conservatives are leading the polls, and we have a federal government, really trying to move to the next step, which is really to find a new leader. So all of that being considered, obviously leadership will listen to what Poilievre has to say. and politically speaking about a lot about economic reconciliation and making sure that First Nations have the means to create their own economy. And I think I just heard him say the other day, well, he wants First Nations to be, the richest people in the world. That may be, taking it a little too far. But this being said, I think people will listen. But at the same time, I think there are fundamental issues that that should be a centerpiece as well. And it goes back to the discussion we had earlier about the threat from the U.S. and how it impacts Canada and how it impacts First Nations as well. So it has to do with land and the resources and the ownership of lands.
The federal government is considering a Competition Bureau investigation of grocery pricing in Canada's north. Canada's Northern Affairs Minister made the comment as he announced an external review of a northern food subsidy. This comes 4 years after a parliamentary committee recommended it, which the government initially resisted. The program provides money to retailers to help bring down the cost of groceries in 124 communities. Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Andrew Furey is stepping down after nearly 5 years in power. Mr. Furey says he couldn't commit to another full term in office with a provincial election set for this year.
For trust and support to become the 14th Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. From the dark days of the pandemic to the brighter future now confirmed by signing the MOU that redefined Churchill Falls. It has been a wild and unexpected journey right from the start to bring us here to today, to the finish. It is with a heart full of pride and hard-earned confidence in the future of Newfoundland and Labrador that I must now move on. Almost exactly 5 years ago to the day, I started my campaign with the admission to each and every one of you that I am not a career politician. I had a list of what I wanted to accomplish, goals that as a proud Newfoundlander and Labradorian, I know I shared with all of you. And through the highs and the lows, bright moments and blind sides, history made and past wrongs rewritten, I feel that what we have accomplished together will no doubt be rock-solid foundation for our province moving forward. I could only leave knowing that that fact is true.
He has asked the Liberal Party to begin a race to replace him. Mr. Furey is the second Atlantic Premier to resign in less than a week after Prince Edward Island Premier Dennis King announced his departure on Thursday. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on social media. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the Newsforum YouTube channel. Good night, Canada.